When I returned to the bridge, Weaver and Sydney were already gone, leaving just the technician Stanton and I to see the shuttle off. It was beyond breathtaking, observing faster-than-light travel from a distance. 1 second, the shuttle was drifting off in the distance. All at once, the space around it warped like the usual gravity lensing we see from black holes, but only for a brief moment. Space returned to normal as quickly as it had distorted, and a brilliant flash of concentrated light blasted off across the expanse of black space. That was the moment everything began to click into place. "Come with me, Stanton," I said and began heading out the exit. I always had a large stride, so I was out the door before he could even respond. "Where are we going?" he asked as he followed behind. "We're going to see what makes this ship tick." Perhaps curiosity truly did kill the cat, because that was all Stanton needed. He followed me wordlessly as we navigated the labyrinthine network of passageways and chutes to the engine compartment. Dr. Bigham had made it known he wanted it to be as difficult as possible for anyone other than him to be able to access this area of the ship. And for all intents and purposes, he succeeded. After what felt like an hour, we finally made it to a long, dark and narrow corridor leading to the engine room. The door required a series of complex puzzles, almost like a video game, along with the chief science officer's code that was now mine. I almost laughed out loud, realizing how silly and over the top this all was. But that was the doctor, heart, body and soul. At last, the familiar hissing of the hydraulics sounded that the door was opening. What lay before us was about the most mundane and boring room you could ever hope to find on a ship. Dr. Bigham, the troll, was definitely starting to come out. The whole room was white, save for a perfectly round black spherical area that filled the entire middle of the room and dipped significantly into the floor, at least a yard or more. A manual computer station, hidden behind a wall, began unfolding its way out as we walked into the room. Stanton and I stood in awe, or maybe befuddlement. I'm not sure which. The sphere was a series of segmented plates made of what looked like marble. I ran my fingers over it and could feel it was still warm to touch despite it having been hours since the ship had stopped. I was trying to piece together how any of this made sense when I looked to the floor and saw a series of words written all around the spherical dip. It was the same phrase repeated over and over again. Outer event horizon limit. The pieces began fitting together almost perfectly. The particle accelerator, the event horizon room, the jump drive. It was such a feat of engineering, yet elegant in its simplicity. My mouth dropped just slightly. "Freaking incredible," was all I could say. What is it?" Stanton asked. "It's a black hole. That's what powers the jump drive. It warps the space around the ship, then the particle accelerator propels the ship forward. It's freaking brilliant, actually." "Holy shit, should we even be in here?" Stanton was beginning to sound panicked, and I don't blame him. As impressive as it was scary just how close to an actual potential black hole we were standing. Probably not, but I'm sure it's turned off. "How do you know?" "We wouldn't be standing here right now if it was. Our atoms would be smashed all over the room." This seemed to calm him. I wanted to explore more, but then the ship's intercom blared overhead.
"Blair, Stanton, we need you in the observation room."
It was Sydney's voice, sounding garbled and worried over the speaker. We left without a word, navigating our way back to the central hub much faster than before. When we arrived, Weaver and Sydney were off in separate corners of the room. Sydney, hovering over her computer screens, looked almost startled to see us come in. "What's the problem?" I asked, fearing more bad news. "Well, I'm not sure. It's hard to explain." Sydney seemed flustered and on the verge of a breakdown. We all were, from the looks of it. When we arrived, I began plotting out a star map to see what the constellations looked like from here. For the most part, there was little variation. "Was?" I responded. I wasn't liking where this was going. Yeah, well, when I was playing back some of the first recordings, I noticed stars that seemed to disappear and reappear, almost at identical intervals. I can't explain it. The whole star vanishes and then reappears just as quickly. It's like something is moving in front of it. But if that were the case, not only would it have to be beyond gigantic, but it would have to be much, much closer to us. Sydney stumbled over her words as if she herself didn't believe what she was saying. Even after everything that had already happened, this was yet more fuel to add to our growing nightmare. I was about to interject when the overhead intercom sounded again, this time from the ship's automated computer. Danger, collision with shuttle imminent. T-minus 10 minutes until impact. What? Are they back already? Sydney and the rest of us began rushing to the observation deck. We gazed from inside the nearly 2-foot thick glass for the shuttle. If they were adrift without the ability to maneuver, then we would have to go spacewalk to retrieve it from hitting the ship. But the other possibilities that sprang from this were far worse. What happened to Roberts and Torrance? Why were they back already? Why couldn't they control the ship? We scanned the black horizon for any sign of the shuttle. It was Stanton that spotted it first. There it is, he said as he pointed upwards off to our left. Sure enough, just barely visible and about quarter of a mile out of the shuttle, drifting slowly towards us. The emergency lights could be seen flashing, but other than that, it looked completely abandoned. What do you think happened? Sydney inquired. I don't know. Weaver, you come with me. Stanton and Sydney, you both make sure the docking area is prepped. We broke into our groups and made haste. Weaver and I suited up and entered the cold vacuum of space yet again in record time. As soon as we tethered the ship, we propelled ourselves towards the approaching shuttle. As we got closer, several things became clear all at once. The airlock doors were open, leaving the cockpit completely compromised. I scanned for any damage, but so far the shuttle looked to be in fine working condition. Weaver entered before me and began locking the doors so we could re-establish the atmosphere and boot the ship's computer back up. I ordered him to keep his suit on, just in case. I had no idea what to expect and wanted us to be as protected as possible. My instincts turned out to be correct. As I was gathering the shuttle's flight recorder to take back with us, Weaver had tended to search the shuttle for our missing comrades. Just as I was removing the shuttle's flight recorder from its wall panel, a commotion sprung up behind me. I spun around to see Weaver now being throttled by another figure in a spacesuit, who I assumed to be either Torrance given his prior behavior. From the looks of it, they had been hiding in a storage locker and jumped Weaver once he opened the door. I reached for the electrical prod from my utility belt, but Weaver was slammed right into me by the suited figure before I could, knocking me to the floor and nearly taking the wind out of me. Weaver was short of breath and could only give me a confused, desperate look before he was launched to the other side of the cabin, banging up against the airlock. Standing above me now was the suited figure, whose visor had been pulled all the way down, masking their identity. I motioned to get up, but was slammed down to the ground by the figure, stomping on my arm and almost fracturing it. In its right hand was the utility axe equipped with all our spacesuits. Just as the axe began to swing down on my head, its body began surging and jolting. From behind, I could see Weaver ramming his electrical prod into the figure over and over again, but nothing seemed to faze it. Seizing the moment, I unclipped my own axe and with only seconds to spare, slammed the metal edge into the side of the figure's helmet, shattering the visor, and finally the suited menace slumped to the floor, me alongside it. For a moment, it was all quiet. Weaver, start the docking procedure, I managed to wheeze out. Weaver went to the cockpit, and within moments, I could feel the ship beginning to automatically pilot towards the loading docks. My gaze, however, was still locked onto the now smashed visor of our attacker. The looming form of the faceless, reflective black suit was terrifying enough. But It was what I didn't see that truly horrified me. I was gazing into the dark space where the person wearing the suit's face should have been, but there was nothing there. I crawled over the figure, expecting it to leap back to life at any moment. It lay still as I brought my face inches to the visor, still staring into that blank void. There was nothing. No eyes, no skin, no face, nothing. I reached into the visor, fingers outstretched. The very tip of my pointer finger made contact with something invisible and fleshy. That was enough for me to recoil my hand back and shriek out loud.
What? What's wrong?
Weaver had sprung into action at the sound of my distress, hands locked onto his prod. I just shook my head and backed into a corner. The shuttle jolted as it docked with the Arkham, and I could hear the airlock pressurize and the voices of Sydney and Stanton sound off from just beyond the doors. But nothing could rip my eyes from the horror of what lay in front of me. Blair, are you hurt? What's wrong? Weaver had never sounded more concerned, and it was this concern that finally snapped me out of my daze. The airlock doors opened, and Sydney rushed in, followed by Stanton. Is everyone okay? We heard fighting over the intercom. Sydney was surveying the scene and saw the crumpled figure in front of us. Who's that? We're not sure yet. They attacked us both as we were getting the shuttle back to the docking platform, Weaver explained. There's nothing there, I said under my breath. What? What do you mean? Weaver asked as he looked towards our suited attacker. But I could see the flash of recognition go across his face as he saw what I saw. What? What happened? Sydney began, but she too saw that nothing was inhabiting the suit. Stanton began moving towards it, but I urged him to stop. I simply grabbed the cord that had tethered us to the ship and began wrapping it around the suit. What are you doing? Sydney sounded almost accusatory. I'm not taking any chances. Weaver joined me in tying up our attacker, and once we were sure it was secure, both of us dragged the suit to the medical bay. Strapped to a table, we tried to break off the suit, but something had happened that had infused multiple parts of the suit and shredded it in other places. Weaver had found some baking powder and used it to spread a layer over where the face of the wearer should be. Sure enough, the form of Robert's face became clear as Weaver coated it with the powder, though her features were warped, and upon closer inspection, her skin appeared to be moving and distorting. I was baffled. The behavior of the suited figure had led me to suspect it was Torrance, but clearly it was not. Now, an even darker question loomed. As he could read my mind, Stanton spoke first. If this is Roberts, then where's Torrance? Nobody had an answer. I remembered the flight recorder, grabbed it without a word, then turned to leave. Stay here and guard her, or whatever that is. I'm getting some goddamn answers, I spat out. I was beyond scared, beyond terrified, beyond confused. The events surrounding us were only getting stranger by the minute. Whatever happened on the shuttle at Alpha Centauri, I knew it held the answers we sought. Footsteps sounded behind me, and I looked to see Weaver running up alongside me. I'm coming with you. No, please, wait with the others. If that thing wakes up, Sydney and Stanton can handle it. Besides, I want to know what happened on that shuttle too. I smiled and silently admired Weaver for his natural curiosity and spirit despite these dire circumstances. We walked briskly back to the central hub, flight recorder in tow, and began the process of accessing the data. The Arkham's communication systems were still completely offline, and so we had to upload the data manually. While we waited, I began pulling up the video archives. Weaver and I watched as Roberts and Torrance took off in the shuttle as they approached the binary star system. That was when things began to shift. The video files became increasingly corrupted, and Roberts and Torrance faded in and out of sea of multicolor static. The audio, though corrupted as well, remained audible. At least for the most horrific parts. Roberts was heard over the recorder, shouting and screaming unintelligibly, while Torrance tried to get her under control. The cabin rocked back and forth, as if pushed from something on the outside.
What's happening? The ship stopped. All systems down. Roberts, what?
Roberts looked to be in a trance from the few clips that managed to get through the static. A split second later, she was gone. It was as if she just phased out of existence.
Roberts, where the hell? Roberts! Roberts!
The audio cut off for a moment, only to resume with the sounds of horrified yelling in the shuttle's computer systems.
Warning, airlock systems deactivated. Cabin depressurizing in 30 seconds.
What are you? Stop! Roberts! What are you doing? Stop! No!
The last split-second image we saw before the video cut out for good was of a suited Roberts by the airlock doors in a frantic Torrance grabbing hold of his seat for dear life before the airlock doors opened, sucking Torrance out of the frame and into the void of space. I thankfully looked away before the worst of it, but judging from the look on Weaver's face, he'd gotten a full look at Torrance's rapid decompression as his screams of agony were sharply cut off. The video and audio stopped after that. The silence in the room was deafening. Once more, all I could detect was our shallow breaths as we absorbed the horror show that had unfolded before us. What the hell was all Weaver could muster. A message flashed on the computer screen, telling us that the data had been fully processed and was ready. Hesitantly, I moved the cursor to the files, and one by one, numerous screens and charts began loading onto my screen. From what I could gather, as the shuttle had approached the side of Alpha Centauri, long-range telescopes began picking up two small bodies of mass in the exact position of the two stars. Though the temperature readings were cooler than any stellar body detected, and the size of the objects were roughly the same as Earth, they both had a mass far greater than anything a planet could substance. It took me a bit longer than normal to come up with the hypothesis, but once it emerged, it nearly took my breath away. I sat back in my chair, shaking my head in disbelief at what I was looking at. Something that had never been discovered before. Something that shouldn't even exist yet. That's not possible, I whispered to myself. What? What's not possible? Weaver was scared, but his fear was nothing compared to mine. I was silent for a moment more, still in utter shock at this newfound discovery. Alpha Centauri. It's still there, but it's become a black dwarf. An icy chill ran all down my body and back up my spine as I said those last words. What's a black dwarf? I didn't expect him to know what it meant. How could he? It was an almost empty and unexplored area of the celestial sciences. It shouldn't exist. It couldn't exist. It was a complete impossibility. This was no lie, however. No trick. No deception. The very first black dwarf discovered by men was less than half a light year away. Black dwarfs are the stellar remnants of white dwarfs after they've cooled to almost absolute zero. It's the final stage of all stars that don't turn into black holes, I explained. So what's the problem? The problem is, these things shouldn't exist yet. The time it takes for a white dwarf to cool is estimated to far exceed the known age of the universe. We're talking quadrillions of years here. But that's impossible. Apparently not, I sarcastically remarked, though the humor was lost amongst the tension and fear that had taken hold since the moment I had awoken from hypersleep. It felt like some fever dream, an ungodly nightmare that I kept hoping and praying would end, that I would awake in my hypersleep chamber, that Dr. Bigham would still be alive, and we would be on our way to make history, ensuring our names are engraved within science books for all time. Reality had been a cruel mistress, and I had an awful feeling She wasn't done yet. What do we do? Weaver sounded more desperate than ever, though I had no answers to offer this time. I don't know if there's anything we can do. If whatever caused this change has made its way to Proxima. My words trailed off. The mysterious fluctuations in light output, the shifting constellations Sydney had reported. Somewhere, something primordial was awakening. Just as those insidious thoughts penetrated my mind, the now ominous voice of the ship's computer sounded off once more. Attention, all personnel report to medical bay. Several crew members have experienced catastrophic injury. Catastrophic injury? I cringed and shuddered at what that could entail. Weaver and I gave one wordless glance to each other before jolting upwards and running down the long corridors to the medical bay. When the doors opened automatically, my eyes were immediately assaulted with a sense of horror I'd only ever seen in movies. I could only register the image of blood coating nearly every surface before the churning in my stomach overpowered me, and I twisted downwards to void the contents of my stomach. Though I was sure I caught the glimpse of what looked like a severed arm hanging off a table. Weaver didn't handle it much better than I did, and we both nearly fell backward into the corridor, the stench of iron clinging to the air. What the actual fuck? I'd never heard Weaver curse before. He had remained so composed, more so than all of us. Yet, it was this breakdown and curse that truly broke me. At the moment, I was convinced none of us were getting back to Earth alive. Sydney, Stanton, Torrance, Roberts, whatever has inhabited her form, was now loose aboard the ship. There's no telling where it could be now. I darted my head, looking down the corridors, half expecting it to come around the corner at any moment. Airlock breached. Warning, depressurization in loading dock. The blaring alarm and booming voice from the computer barely registered at first. It took Weaver shaking me and grabbing me off of the floor to break me free. We gotta go! Come on, Blair! Weaver was reasserting control, and it was all I needed to free my mind. We both grabbed our helmets and began running towards the loading docks. We turned the corner when the airtight doors dropped down almost directly in front of us. Just a few steps further and it would have split us right down the middle. Ship atmosphere compromised, sealing all airtight doors. From behind the now sealed doors, we could hear the pull of space sucking everything it could into the vacuum. A loud bang came from the doors. Whatever was on the other side, it knew we were here and it was coming for us. My heart skipped a beat and I contemplated the entirety of my life and everything that had led to this moment. I was half tempted to throw open the doors and launch myself into space, letting the void carry me into eternity. Something else was stirring inside of me though. A feeling I had never known before. It felt animalistic and raw. No, I wasn't ready to give up just yet. The fight to survive overpowered my fear for the first time. One way or another, this was going to end right here and now. Thinking on my feet, I called to Weaver. Put your helmet on. I've got an idea. Weaver didn't question it and fastened his helmet on just as quickly as I did. We both hitched ourselves to the wall, and once I was in place, I silently looked over at Weaver, now unsure if this was a good idea. I peered deep into his eyes, looking for any sign that I should stop. But he only nodded to me, and that was all I needed to feel that surge of adrenaline again. My heart now racing and the heat in my head swelling, I took the plunge and deactivated the airtight doors. The moment they opened, the cold vacuum of space roared back to life, pulling us with great force towards it. The suction only lasted a few seconds, and soon the weightlessness of zero gravity surrounded us both. Looking ahead, I could only see Roberts, or what she had now become, floating in the doorway. Large chunks of the suit had been ripped off, and now the form that inhabited her remains looked more menacing than ever. There was no warning, no sound, nothing. All at once, the form charged full speed ahead towards us. I braced myself for impact, but couldn't have predicted the force at which it slammed into me. The jumbled mass of ripped fabric and bent metal began lunging at me, doing whatever it could to land as much damage as possible. I reached for my utility axe, but this time it had expected this and ripped it right out of my hands. Its gloved fists started pummeling into my suit and visor. Just as I thought, it would shatter the visor as I had done before. Weaver charged in from my side and slammed my attacker into the wall. My head was spinning from the attack and I couldn't see straight at first. I watched as Weaver attempted to subdue the creature, but with no success. After trying to break his visor with its fist and failing, it tried a new tactic and began slamming its face over and over into Weaver's. I knew he only had seconds left. Summoning all the strength I could, I propped my feet against the wall and launched my body with as much force as I could muster towards the airlock. Arms outstretched, I grabbed hold of the suited menace and carried us away through the corridor and towards the open mouth of space. Just before we reached the gateway, the suit twisted around and pushed us into the airlock walls. It started banging its head into mine with such ferocity. One crack appeared, then two, then more. At that moment, I surrendered to my fate. I said a small prayer for Weaver and reached for my prod. This was it. I was on the edge of oblivion, and I wasn't taking any prisoners. With every last bit of energy I had left, I activated the prod and pushed it straight into the open visor and deep into the suit. The suit convulsed, and through the small bit of powder still left, I watched as a look of pure agony was permanently etched into her face. Just as quickly as it began, its arms went limp and the convulsions stopped. The now motionless form drifted slowly backward and through the gateway, out of the ship, and into space. I was becoming lightheaded from the escaping oxygen and quickly closed the airlock doors to re-establish the atmosphere. I tried to stand up, but my body was beginning to crash from the adrenaline spike. So I tumbled down onto the floor as the gravity turned back on. My breathing became shallow, and once again, I was ready to surrender. Though it lasted only half a minute at best, the fight felt like I had climbed Mount Everest in a single minute. My heart was throbbing and at a risk of exploding through my ribs. The motion of someone removing my helmet and the rush of fresh air now filling my lungs brought me clarity. I looked up to see Weaver's worried but smiling face just inches from mine, and thought at that moment that I'd never seen a more handsome man in my life. I smiled back and laughed. Weaver laughed in return, and for once, the tension and dread that had filled us both was momentarily gone. He pulled me back to my feet, and slowly we made our way back to the central hub. I locked the doors and sealed the windows, though I'm not sure why. They wouldn't do us much good against whatever force of nature lurked just beyond. We both slunk to the floor, exhausted and unsure of what to say or do next. Weaver was the first to break the silence with a single question. "So, what is your hypothesis, Doctor?" He was attempting to be funny and let out a forced chuckle that I returned in kind. But to be fair, it was a valid question. I had been so lost in confusion and panic that I never really thought about the possibilities. What had happened to Captain Roberts? What had corrupted her, and why? What thing transformed Alpha Centauri into a cosmic graveyard? I'm not sure. I think maybe some sort of life form, but big, massive, something that would need an enormous amount of energy to survive. I thought about Roberts and how some part of her remained on that operating table. The way her skin moved and folded, she had either become invisible or assimilated somehow by this entity. This was the most puzzling of all. What had consumed her? What exactly was this thing made of? Normal baryonic matter seemed unlikely. What were the alternatives? The way it had reacted to the electric prod had been telling. I thought of more exotic forms of matter, such as dark matter and antimatter. We've never observed them before, and don't know if they even exist. But if they did exist, and there was enough of it gathered in one place, then there's no telling what could happen. Life sprung from literal hellfire during the early days of Earth. What would stop life from arising from the cold and empty tomb of space? It doesn't matter what it is. Not anymore, I said dejectedly. It was the hard truth, but the truth nonetheless. We sat in silence once more. I'm not sure for how long. Maybe a minute, maybe an hour. The ship's computer, which had comically been the bearer of bad news, had one last omen of bad fortune to give us, and immediately caught our attention. Attention, abnormal gravitational anomaly detected. I jumped up and made my way to the window, standing as close as I could. I searched. It didn't take long to find it. From afar, space and light from the stars began to warp in odd, undefinable ways. It seemed like the very fabric of space and time was folding and unfolding, twisting the constellations into something unrecognizable. The Arkham was positioned roughly 2 light minutes away, giving us plenty of space to watch the scene unfold safely, relatively speaking, but close enough for us to get a full view of Proxima Centauri's final fate. There are some events that defy explanation. No words invented by mankind could ever sum up the fear, horror, and pure existential dread witnessing that behemoth devour the Red Dwarf. I'm sure that, no matter how long I live, every time I close my eyes, that haunting image will be there, waiting for me. As the mass got closer, I could see small strands of superheated plasma begin to break away from the Red Dwarf. I watched in a mix of awe and horror as this monster of the universe began to cannibalize the last member of the Centauri system. The entire scene would have looked spectacular had it not been so nightmarish. Weaver was standing next to me, and all I wanted at that moment was another human to hold, to connect to protect me. Almost on instinct, I reached for his hand and wrapped my fingers around his. He didn't resist. In fact, he gripped my hand in his own. God Almighty! I'd never been a religious person myself, but Weaver's words seemed more than appropriate. We have to do something, I said, though I knew it was futile. As small and insignificant as we were, what could we do to fight against this gigantic leviathan? There was no force of nature we could harness that would stand a chance at annihilating this thing. Nothing. Outside of a black hole. I had completely forgotten about the engine room. It was a lifetime away, even though it couldn't have been more than a few hours ago. I know what we have to do, I said plainly, my mind now racing to formulate a plan. I explained the engine room black hole generator and how it was what powered the warp drive. If we could pilot the ship into Proxima Centauri and breach the event horizon, that would result in an enormous explosion that should tear apart whatever it is. I was giddy as the plan began to unfold. We might actually have a chance at saving ourselves and potentially everyone back on Earth. Can we remote pilot the ship from the shuttle? Weaver asked. And just like that, my moment of glory had already collapsed, and I could feel the color drain from my face. The communication systems aboard the Arkham had never been fixed, and now it was too late to attempt any repairs. We can't, not from the shuttle. We have to pilot the ship manually, which means... Weaver cut me off and finished my sentence himself. One of us will have to stay behind. Of course, there was always a catch, a price to be paid. My search for the ultimate questions of the universe was what led me here, and now it was only fitting that I be the one to stay behind and witness the end of my journey. You go in the shuttle. I'll stay behind, I offered selflessly. There was no hesitation. So many of my questions had been answered. And though so many remained, I no longer wanted the answers. "No, you have to go." I expect him to say that. I was just about to refute him, but he stopped me. He grabbed my shoulders softly and looked deep beyond my eyes, into my very soul. "Stop. We don't have time to argue about this. Because of you and Dr. Bigham, I got the opportunity to be part of something so much bigger than myself. Something that is going to change the course of human history. It was you and the doctor that got us here. But the people back on Earth, they still need you. What if there are more of these things? With the jump drive, humanity will truly have the keys to the stars. But that won't happen if you don't make it back. You have to go." Tears had already begun to pool around my eyes as he spoke. I didn't want to listen, but I knew that he was right. There was no guarantee the shuttle would even survive the return trip. It was a miracle we had even survived in the first place. The thought of some other abomination hiding in the dark, hungry and searching for another star, made it all too clear what we had to do. But I wasn't going to leave Weaver behind. Not without telling him the truth. "Weaver, I couldn't say it. I wasn't even sure what it was. I had never felt this way about another human before. And our time together had been so short. It wasn't fair. Why did it have to be this way?" He just looked into my eyes, the way he did before, then wrapped his arms around me in an embrace. His salt and peppered hair was so soft, and his skin so warm. His voice was velvety smooth as he spoke into my ear. "I know." We then stared into each other's eyes, knowing it would be for the last time. It was a moment I never thought would happen. It was small, maybe only half a minute, but that was all I needed. The passion that burned between us, though, would have outshone the sun. After it was over, I looked back up and spoke the last words I would ever say to him. "You know what to do?" He only nodded his head. Before I was overcome with grief, I tore myself from his arms and headed towards the exit. As I left, I took one last look behind me. Weaver had already begun strapping himself into the cockpit and beginning the launch sequence. His eyes met mine for one final time. He smiled weakly, and without a word, I turned on my heel and ran as fast as I could into the loading dock. It had become easy to navigate the ship by this point, so I was on board and beginning my own launch sequence within minutes. I watched as the Arkham faded quickly into view, marveling one last time at Dr. Bigham's creation. I still didn't know how he created the black hole engine and had no idea where to start. I could only hope and pray I would live long enough to find out. I began activating the engine and particle accelerator, then charted a path far out into the Proxima system. I couldn't leave without making sure Weaver had succeeded. The titanic gravitational pull from before was much less intense, given the smaller size of the shuttle, but still strong. Piloting had not been my strongest area of training, but I handled the shuttle easily enough, much to my astonishment. When the jump drive disengaged, I turned the ship back around to face Proxima Centauri, which was now little more than a fuzzy red dot in the distance. The distortions from the entity and lensing effect could still be seen as well, only on a much smaller scale. I waited, and waited, and waited. After a few minutes, I began to fear something had happened to the ship and was ready to drive straight into the star myself. But then, it happened. Without any warning, an enormous burst of light shined like 1,000 burning suns. I shielded my eyes as best as I could and waited. There was no sound, no vibrations. I was much too far away to feel anything. But as the light faded, I was finally able to see it happen. The black hole was now sucking the entire mass of Proxima Centauri into the event horizon, and from the looks of it, the entity as well. The space and time distortion spiked for just a second, before warping inwards and towards the singularity. The rest of the red dwarf began to spread around into a bright accretion disk. Before now, Proxima had never been visible to the naked eye. But within 4 years, it would be one of the brightest objects in the night sky. I waited for what must have been hours. I had to be sure. I needed to be certain it was dead. Nothing emerged. No more distortions. No detection of the anomaly. As far as I could tell, it had crossed the inner horizon and was now being shredded to its most basic particles around the singularity. It was only after I was certain it was gone that I felt the first sign of relief since I had woken up. They say in space, no one can hear you scream. Though I'm sure if you were listening, you could have heard me crying. I sobbed, screamed, cursed, yelled. It came out all at once. The floodgates opened, and I couldn't close them. Afterwards, I sat in the cockpit and just stared out into space. Since I was a kid, I'd always seen it as the final frontier. A never-ending fountain of questions, just waiting to be solved. But now, I know the truth. Some things aren't meant to be discovered. Some questions are better left unanswered. After wiping the last tears from my face, I began plotting my course back to Seoul. Before I was about to engage the autopilot, I thought of the mammoth journey that lay ahead of me. There were 1,000 things that could go wrong. What if this shuttle had been damaged somehow during the assault? What if I died in hypersleep like Dr. Bigham? I couldn't risk not leaving behind a record of these events to show the people of Earth what Weaver, Roberts, Torrance, Sidney, Stanton, and Dr. Bigham gave to protect them. It will be my greatest failure should this message not reach you. I'm broadcasting on all radio frequencies and sending this message through all channels. My only hope is that someone, somewhere back on Earth, finds this before they find you. My name is Damian Blair, junior astrophysicist and the last survivor of the space research vehicle, Arkham. And I'm coming home.